Welcome back, America. It's Friday morning, May the 29th, in the year of the plague, 2020. And my guest this morning is State Department Senior Spokesperson Morgan Ortagus. You can follow her on Twitter at State Department Spox, and Department is shortened DEPTSPOX. That's counterintuitive for the Steelers fans out there. I don't know if Twitter will allow her to keep talking, but she is talking about Hong Kong. So we're very good to have. I always tell people, by the way, my son works at State with Morgan, so I've got a conflict of interest. I don't hit her with a hammer or anything like that when she comes on. Good morning, Morgan. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks for
Uh,
having me again.
I laugh about Twitter. Before we go to the serious stuff about Hong Kong, it's the most absurd thing I've ever seen. And I don't think it's going to change you or the secretary's approach to Twitter at all, will it?
No, I mean, we're very focused on the international side. So I spend a lot of time working with my team trying to figure out how we get our message into places like Iran and China. And obviously, those people and can't use Twitter or Facebook or all these things. So, we're very focused on the people of the world who don't even have access to the internet or to unregulated, social media companies.
I just talked with Senator Rick Scott. He pointed out that the Ayatollah Khamenei, maybe I pointed that out, he pointed out Nicolas Maduro. Those are two of the preeminent Twitter users that Twitter and Jack don't censor in any way, shape, or form. It's a little bit ironic.
Well, we see it every day. The editor of the Global Times, which is the main propaganda outlet of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, we see him and other Chinese Communist Party officials, their ambassadors, are on Twitter around the world, spewing conspiracies. The conspiracy theory that the U.S. Army is the one that spread the coronavirus. I believe it first emanated from Chinese officials on Twitter. So their ambassadors around the world are prolific users of Twitter. They're still trying to figure it out. Sometimes we laugh a little at their translations. But they certainly, we have something at the State Department called the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, and we've uncovered some malicious bot networks now that the Chinese are starting to use that mirror actually what the Russians are doing, and it's pretty fascinating once you start getting into the research of what the GEC has uncovered.
We'll go back to Hong Kong in just a second, Morgan Ortagus. But when it does come to disinformation campaigns, how does the Department of State, do you hand that off to Homeland Security? Do you alert the companies like Twitter and Facebook that are targeted by the bots? How do you alert people that they are, in fact, being used by our adversaries?
That's a great question. So our mandate, obviously, at the State Department is overseas. It's international. So anything that touches the domestic side, we don't have purview over there. So yes, we'd hand it over to our sister agencies to have purview, like FBI, DHS, and others. But we do. So Leah Gabriel heads our GEC, and she will work behind the scenes with social media companies and say, look, here's what we've uncovered. We think you should look into this. We've actually had a couple. Guy Taylor from the Washington Times did a long piece on this as well, as did Betsy Woodruff, who's now at Politico. So we've got some good sources out there where we have exposed our research, and we try to maybe like every 6 weeks when we have something that we can unclassify and share with the public. We do try to make sure people are aware. But the one fascinating thing that I would leave you with on this that people probably don't realize that we've uncovered during COVID-19 is the sort of trifecta between China, Iran, and Russia. So these countries are learning a lot from Russia and their disinformation campaigns. And you will see these three countries. We can see their malicious networks, on Twitter and other social media companies. They will start to retweet each other and use the same lines and source each other as as the reason for XYZ conspiracy theory, whatever it is. So the three of them have definitely we've seen the three of them converge together in their malicious use of social media.
An iron triangle of disinformation. Let's turn to Hong Kong, Morgan
There you
Ortagus.
go.
I
Yes,
have
sir.
been following, and I really tried via the South China Morning Post and a bunch of other sources to find out exactly how many people are being arrested, how widespread are the demonstrations. Can you give us a sense on Friday morning in the United States on the East Coast, what it looks like in Hong Kong as the day is ending and the week is ending, a week that goes down in infamy in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I would encourage your viewers to or your listeners to look at Jimmy Lai. and Joshua Wong and some other prominent pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong that are on Twitter, and they're giving great updates. I think that they are. There's definitely a sense, at least I felt this sense too, and talked to other people who work in Hong Kong. About a week ago, when the Chinese Communist Party signaled at their National People's Congress that they would be voting on this, what they call "quote unquote" national security legislation towards Hong Kong. For me and many others, and I think for a lot of these prominent pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, there was this, just sense of a sense of dread and really a sense of loss, because you knew that the Chinese Communist Party they would have a difficult time not passing this legislation, and that was sort of the final nail in the coffin for us, for Hong Kong. So what happened this week is Secretary Pompeo had delayed by several months a report that he has to submit to Congress. So we submitted it last March. This report certifies the autonomy of Hong Kong from China. We're required to do that by law. So since we last did that in March of 2019, we saw the extradition law, which essentially said that Hong Kong citizens, for any sort of, infraction, could be extradited to the mainland, which, ensued a year's worth of thousands and thousands of people to the streets in Hong Kong protesting. That, of course, we saw violent crackdowns to those protests, arbitrary arrests and detainment, and really an erosion of the rule of law. And then, we've been watching this for a year, and then finally, when the Chinese Communist Party announced that they would be doing for this legislation, we should remind ourselves, in this legislation, the National People's Congress are essentially calling the freedom-loving, peaceful protesters in Hong Kong, they're calling them terrorists. So they're using the language of national security to call free people, to call peaceful protesters terrorists, and so under the guise of national security, they want to shut down all of these protests. So we had to make the very sad decision, the Secretary Pompeo did, in order to certify to Congress this week that we can no longer, with a straight face, certify to the Congress that Hong Kong is indeed autonomous from China.
Now, I want to underscore Jimmy Lai, who's been a guest on this show this month, and his
Oh, great.
Twitter account is Jimmy Lai Apple. All right, that's very easy to remember. Jimmy, Lai, capital Apple, Jimmy Lai Apple. He only has 56,000 followers, and I wish everybody in this audience would go and follow Jimmy Lai and retweet, because he is becoming sort of the voice of free Hong Kong, and the fight isn't over. The fact that the law has been passed is not dispositive. They only have 5,000 troops in Hong Kong. But what do you expect to happen there, Morgan? What has the secretary said about what's ahead?
So the president has indicated that he's going to have a press conference at 3 p.m., I think around 3 p.m. today, but definitely this afternoon, where he's going to lay out a lot of our options. Hugh, this is one of the things where I think there's a pretty big bipartisan consensus of outrage of what the Chinese government is trying to do towards Hong Kong, and so there's a lot of places in foreign policy, like Iran, JCPOA, and other areas that I deal with, Afghanistan, others, which get highly partisan, very easily. On this one, I've been very, very encouraged to see, both sides of the aisle speaking out against this legislation. And so I think the president has a lot of options at his disposal. I know that you have many members of Congress on your show that have probably talked about options. So I'm always careful about getting out in front of the president. But, I just want to say that it makes me very pleased and proud to work for Secretary Pompeo and President Trump, because there has been this tendency, and this is the third administration that I've worked in, so I've worked for Republicans and Democrats, but there's this tendency sometimes in international relations for those of us not to want to deal with the hard issues and to want to talk about the world as the way we want it to be. And a real fundamental piece of foreign policy for Secretary Pompeo is calling out the world exactly the way it is, recognizing reality. We all I think Hong Kong has a special place in the heart of the American people. So many students go there for education, maybe to take a semester or two abroad. I was on Wall Street for a while, so I have many colleagues, that are desirous to go to Hong Kong and do a tour there for a year or two if you're in business or the financial community. So I think Hong Kong has a special place in the heart of the American people, but we're literally seeing nothing more than a communist takeover of the largest financial hub in Asia.
No, I had Senator Chris Coons, Democrat of Delaware, on Wednesday, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, on yesterday. You could not tell the difference between them when they
Hmm.
spoke about Hong Kong, and that's very good. And they speak in terms of maybe granting residency to Hong Kong students who are here, expelling non Hong Kong students, mainland students, as a show of displeasure. And the conversation that Robert O'Brien had with Chuck Todd over the weekend, I know that Secretary
Right.
Pompeo said the same thing, which is we expect global financial centers to migrate to Singapore. Is that what you're expecting if this crackdown continues, Morgan Ortagus, for the banks to leave?
We'll see. These banks, and I worked for one of them that has a major hub in Hong Kong. They will certainly do a risk assessment of what is the best position for themselves and for their employees. And a lot of these banks, like I said, you have Americans, Britons, other people that going to Hong Kong is a massive treasure and opportunity because you want to get experience in Asia, but yet you used to be able to be in a free and open system. And now, given what the Chinese Communist Party has decided to do, you're essentially going to be living under a Communist Party type system. So I think, listen, I want to also point out to your listeners that we put out a joint statement the United States did yesterday with the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia condemning this action from the National People's Congress. And I think that's so important that our allies are standing up with us and speaking up with us, especially those countries who signed on to the joint statement. I think that this is a pivotal moment in history. I think this is a moment of history that, my children, our grandchildren are going to look back and study because this is the moment where every democracy, everyone who loves freedom around the world stood up to be counted. And they either stood up to the Chinese Communist Party and stood up for the rule of law or they didn't. And I think there's going to be a lot of shame on the people who didn't.
Well said, Morgan Ortagus. It is certainly bipartisan. It is nonpartisan. I am glad to hear it as an alliance issue, and I'm glad I did not know about that declaration. I will go and read that during the break. Morgan Ortagus, thanks for spending so much time for us this morning. Again, follow Jimmy Lai Apple and follow State Department Spox, and it's State DEPT SPOX to find out what Morgan is tweeting out every day as the Hong Kong